Hello, everyone, all you Zoomers. Welcome to our roundtable discussion, Power, Sex, and Climate Change, which is part of a series of public programs intended to engage you with open dance projects, research, and creative process in the lead up to the premiere of their new immersive dance, All the Devils Are Here, a Tempest in the Galapagos, in May 2021. I'm Xandra Eden, Director of DiverseWorks, and we are proud to be Open Dance Project's commissioning and presenting partner on this project. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. Before we begin, I'd like us to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the original inhabitants of the lands on which DiverseWorks resides. I'm speaking to you from a land currently called Houston. It lies within the ancestral territories of the Karankawa and Atakapa Ishak peoples. I acknowledge this land as occupied, unceded territory, and pay tribute to those peoples here. For those of you who'd like to do the same, please introduce yourself and make your own land acknowledgement in the chat. Thank you. Today's program will be moderated, facilitated, and excellently elaborated by Niki Kasumi Clements, who's a professor of religion and distinguished teaching in the humanities at Rice University. Dr. Clements is an ethicist working on how humans can shape their lives through daily practices and come to critique the social, political, cultural, and economic and ecological factors that render humans differentially vulnerable to structural violence. But first, we have a special behind the scenes video by Open Dance Project Artistic Director, Annie Arnoult. And the sound is not running, so we'll start that again.
Hello, I am Annie Arnoult, Artistic Director of Open Dance Project and the Choreographic Director of All the Devils Are Here, a Tempest in the Galapagos. Just moments ago, this great big studio behind me was filled with ensemble members in rehearsal and creation of this immersive project, which will premiere in May and which we are talking about together right now. The project is a co-production of DiverseWorks and Open Dance Project and supported by the National Performance Network Creation Fund grant and lots of other really wonderful, generous supporters. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for keeping art alive in this crazy time. The story that provides the source material for this show is Shakespeare's The Tempest. We are using a post-colonial read of that play using just 4 characters: Prospero, who we have made Prospera, Miranda, Ariel, and Caliban. There is lots of power structure in those 4 characters. There are interesting gender and sexual questions in those characters. And they are magical characters who are trapped on an island, much like the other Truth is Stranger Than Fiction characters in our show. Those characters are true historical characters who come from the 1920s and 30s, not long after William Beebe, who was a naturalist and scholar following in the footsteps of Darwin, had gone to the Galapagos and specifically the island of Floriana, piqued the interest of many European intellectuals, including the dentist Friedrich Ritter and his lover Dora Strauch, who left their husband and wife back at home and ran away to the island of Floriana to take a deep dive into Nietzsche and Lao Tse and naturalism. So these wonderful, curious, strange folk went to escape the world of man, but wrote home about it. And so, because their story was so interesting and the idea of living on an uninhabited, gorgeous island in the Galapagos was so intriguing, they were soon followed. First by a family, the Wittmers, a mother, father, and teenager who had lots of lung trouble. And secondly, by a self-styled baroness and her 2 gay lovers and a servant. She saw herself a bit of a Mae West character, walked around with a gun, also really had dreams of being a Hollywood starlet. So there's all kinds of crazy, wonderful conflicts of morals and ideas in these characters. And we are overlaying the Tempest on top of that just to make things a little bit more strange. We are super excited to take a deep dive into ideas around power, sex, climate change, all of which have deep roots both in the real story and in the Tempest and in the location of Floriana, the island in the Galapagos where we are setting our story. And that is where we're going to jump off from for today's work.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much, Annie Arnoult, who we will be looking forward to hearing more from in the course of today's panel. I'm going to introduce the 3 primary panelists in individual order, and after I introduce them, they will proceed with about 2 to 3 minute presentation on their background and work, as well as a taste of what interests them in this fascinating project. We start with Ryan McGettigan, who is a scenic designer of theater, opera, and dance based in New York and working across the country and Europe. He's a resident designer at Cape Rep Theater in Brewster, Mass, and a company artist with Prague Shakespeare Company and Houston's Classical Theater Company. Houston credits also include previous collaborations with Open Dance Project, Theater Under the Stars, Stages Repertory Theater, Queensbury Theater, Fourth Wall Theater, and Catastrophic. Welcome, Ryan.
Hi. As a scenic designer, it's my job to interpret a script or libretto, or in this case, a storyline dance project, and envision the physical element, this physical environment in which the story can take place in a way that incorporates conceptual themes and ideas, historical structure, necessities like time period and location, as well as commenting on the larger context of the piece, the why this piece now question. When collaborating with Annie and Open Dance Project specifically, we're also creating an immersive design, which means that there's no typical audience performer boundaries. There's no structured audience seating zone. The audience is welcomed and encouraged to populate and explore the space as a whole. And that means walking around and engaging with and exchanging space with the dancers, opening drawers and flipping through books and looking through all the accoutrement that is dressed around the set, and really engaging as an active participant within this environment. For All the Devils Are Here specifically, let me start a screen share. Oops, scroll here. For All the Devils Are Here, when the audience enters into the space, we enter through a sort of abstract representation of a ship, making this big journey, the billowing sails, canvas made out of canvas and plastic. There's a climbable rope ladder. And this as the introduction creates a sense of adventure and camaraderie with the characters that are introduced. We're all in the same boat and we've all been transplanted after this same journey. Throughout this, storms and seas will fill the sails through video projections. Shout out to David DeVoe, who's the projection designer, who's here with us today as well in the audience. And we eventually arrive on the island of Floriana with, one of the first environments we see once we are on the island with Ritter and Strauch and Wittmers and the Baroness and her lovers is Post Office Bay. It's a hub of communication with the outside world. As Annie mentioned in her video, each of these people is, here escaping society, but at the same time shooting out their story. We're in the height of yellow journalism, and it's what's more exciting than the tropical scandals. Each of them has a sort of different PR campaign. There's filmmaking going on and hotel guests to come. There's during this time period that the historical story is set, there's also a lot of military and passenger ships that come as voyeurs to check out this these crazy characters in person. There's a camp set up that we have that sort of functions as a singular representation of each of the three environments in which these the inhabitants of the island took over or created. There's a permanent base structure with elements that can be added and removed throughout the action of the show, sort of building up and then also taking over or usurping from somebody else. Driftwood, bamboo sort of feel to it, and plastic sheeting above that creates another projectable surface, David DeVoe, and creates movement with through fans, this sort of kinetic energy and this rising tension and sort of tempest as the tensions on the island increase. In the overall surround, we create this sort of jungle and this overhanging foliage out of recycled elements. There's recycled water bottles or drink bottles that create the overall fauna, flora, and woven jungle vines, leaves and rope, and tree trunks created out of stacked used barrels and buckets. Surrounding the entirety is a sense of water walls, rising water walls created out of this blue tarps and plastic sort of vinyl flooring, and a intense sort of boundary of water, creating that sense of island, but also of movement and again that kinetic energy as the tensions are rising, as the heat increases. We see the waters rising and surrounding them into the eventual tipping point to the story. All of the surrounding elements, part of the sort of nature elements that are these recycled and reused, are all elements that can be interacted with the Tempest creatures, the sort of mythic creatures, versus the sort of historical entities, the characters. Overall, the design is a melding of historical and the conceptual elements that are able to be built upon and altered by the performers and the audience as well. It gives us a sense of discovery and adventure and exploring the utopian island, but also morphing with the story as the tensions rise toward that inevitable tipping point. That is my brief introduction into this, and we're going to get back to a lot of it, I'm sure.
You need to let me come back onto the video. Sorry, host. Oh, please stick around, Ryan. Well, you don't need to see me in order to hear me. So I will take the opportunity to move to our next guest, who is Lina, who is a multidisciplinary artist and holds a PhD in anthropology. Her installations and compositions range from the experimental to the ethnographic and investigate sociotechnic and ecological change. Dib is an affiliate artist at the Topological Media Lab at Concordia University in Montreal and is a professor and fellow at Rice University in the program in Writing and Communication and the Center for Environmental Studies. Welcome, Lena.
It's good to be here. Hi, everyone. So as Niki was saying, I'm a multimedia artist, and I also teach, and I'm a fellow at the Center for Energy. So I teach classes on art and environment. So we can see why I'm really interested and fascinated by this project. My creative practices really draw from the world around me. And even when my work dwells in abstraction, it's still informed by something in Quebec that we call research creation. So again, these two processes really kind of go hand in hand. And we can talk more about that sort of creative process and how it's informed. It's not always a straight line. I stage immersive and participatory encounters. I'll show you guys a couple quick excerpts. And with my work, I think through different notions like power, interconnectedness, relationships, ecology, and home. So I've been asked to share my work, and I want to keep things brief. So I've prepared a couple short excerpts installation videos. And the first is from a piece called Threshold that I think some of you have seen. It was shown as part of Day for Night a few years ago, and then at Galveston Arts Center. It's an interactive audiovisual installation, and it's centered on the Gulf Shore. It's filmed right before sunset at the kind of pinkish cusp of something about to go down. The video slows down and the audio also slows to a deep rumble as the audience or participants get closer to the water. And then when the video is at a near standstill, when it's slowed down, then viewers can kind of liquefy the image with their bodies. I'll show you guys very quickly what that looks like or feels like. Here we go. And then I will show you another video, but I want to mention one of the dancers in that last video is Danielle Antelo, who also told me a few years ago that I absolutely had to meet Annie. So this next video is of a piece called Like There's No Tomorrow. It was first shown on Main Street here in Houston, and those images are from that. And then it also went and traveled to Governor's Island in New York. This piece, Like There's No Tomorrow, is a footage of Flower Garden Bank's National Reef, which is off of the Gulf Shore as well. I got to work with NOAA scientists during this project, which was really interesting. And the piece creates a kind of bleaching effect as viewers interact with the piece or as cars drive by. So I will show you that. And currently I have a piece up commissioned by the City of Houston, administered by Art League. This piece is called Sounds of Tomorrow, the Oracle Tree. And it's a sound piece at Exploration Green, which is in Clear Lake. And it's a golf course turned nature conservancy. So it's a really interesting place, and I really highly recommend it. The work is located in this majestic pine tree that's really visible from almost all parts of phase 1 of this park. And the compositions that make up the sounds are field recordings based on the different species that inhabit that park, and then also some musical notes made using the sounds of those species. So kind of breaking up bird songs, frogs, etc., into notes and then playing those. And then the different soundtracks play based on tomorrow's weather. So tomorrow's weather sort of determines the way the piece sounds. So you need to kind of visit it frequently or at different times if you want to hear all of the different kind of sounds. So essentially, if it's going to rain, you're going to hear rain, even if it's sunny outside, etc. To sum up, here, let me just stop the screen share really quickly. I'm really interested in open dance projects piece. Thank you, DiverseWorks, for inviting us. And I think we'll have a chance to really talk more about it. But in terms of how it relates to climate change, but also in terms of a kind of embodied practice, right? How do we make things felt, and how do we tackle these sort of large issues and think about our own bodies within these sort of tidal or huge crises? So I'm excited to dive more into that. Thank you, Niki.
Thank you so much, Lina. And our third panelist is Rachel AffyQuinn, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Houston. Her transnational feminist cultural studies scholarship focuses on mixed race, gender, and sexuality in the African diaspora. And her forthcoming book is about Dominican women's transnational identities in Santo Domingo, coming out in May 2021. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. It's really a treat to be here and be in this conversation. I have been, in Houston for about 8 years, and DiverseWorks has been a place that I know I can always land to be in conversation. It was nice to be invited to offer some of my expertise, which is in areas particularly around critical race theory and my work in the Dominican Republic on an island, and talking with Dominican women about their experiences of race and racial fluidity and also gender. And I do a lot of analysis through visual culture. With this project I'm just getting to learn about, I'm excited about thinking about the archive. I have a next book project that looks at Philippa Schuyler, a child prodigy who's mixed race, and her travels around the world. But a lot of her archive is photography. And so I'm curious about how we look at representation and what we're placing on our analysis. I teach courses on Blackness and visual culture, and I teach also feminist theory and methodology. And I'm excited about thinking about the community and collaboration and these conversations and the challenges of collectivity. So I don't have slides for my introduction here, but I do want to talk with our community about images that we'll be sharing. And I'll put some links, I think, in the chat as well to some other projects I'm involved in. One is South Asian Youth in Houston Unites, where I really am thinking about how do we apply Black feminist theory and transnational feminist theory to doing work with South Asian Houstonians and Texans in building community. I guess in gender studies, I'm interested in queerness, malleability, and in thinking about the agency of women and the ways that we're constantly working against representations that are already existing to form our own identity and experience. So I have a background also in documentary film, and there is a related documentary film project to some of the content of this dance project. And, as someone who sees themselves as like a consumer of the arts and a patron of the arts, I'm sort of shifting into thinking about the different ways that we can convey our identity and experiences through visual culture, through movement. And so that I'm looking forward to talking across this diverse community about these things. So we'll leave it at that for now.
All right, while my video gets started back up, we'll move back to Annie Arnoult.
Hello, you guys. We are going to take just a super quick moment to throw back to a movement generation workshop that we did with quite a few of the panelists who are actually our moderator was a part of it. And then a lot of you guys who are watching this and our audience, you guys participated in this. So we want to just make a quick connection to how it is that these ideas and thoughts actually become movement, right? So we're going to take you through the process. Here's the bonus. You're not on video. So only our panelists are going to have to move and groove a little bit, but they get to stay in their seats. So here's how it works. I'm going to share with you guys an image. This is part of our source material here. Got to get to the right one. This is the one that you want to be seeing. All right, so this is an image of Baroness von Wagner. We had a quick introduction about her. She is one of the people who showed up on Floriana. And she came to create a hotel, La Hacienda Paraíso. And her vision was that wealthy people from all over the world would come and stay at her hotel. It was a little bit funny to the rest of the inhabitants of the island because it was a tent. It really was a tent. There was nothing else, and she was already advertising it. She, in this image, is creating a silent film. that she was producing there on the island and hoped to send out to the world. I'm not going to give you any more context than that, because part of what we're interested in, this connects to Rachel's work, we're interested in visual representation, we're interested in what it is that these images jog in your mind. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do is use the chat function and just start giving us some word associations. Panelists, you can jump in here too. So what does this image make you think of, right? Words, ideas. What do we see here? So I'm seeing colonialism, fear, intrigue, Hollywood, curiosity, strange, sexuality, drama. Looking at the looker, exploration. I'm just reading out what I'm seeing on the chat in case folks aren't able to see the chat. Play. Right, we'll take just a few more seconds here. Guns, violence, rage, weapons. Pow pow, it's great, we're getting some sonic responses. Adventure, vision, pioneer, survival. Excellent. All right, we got a ton of that. Okay, I want you guys to choose one of those words, right? If you have another word in your head and you didn't shout it out in the chat, that's a-okay. You can steal someone else's word from the chat, or you can use your own. I want everybody to close their eyes. Super important that you actually do the closing your eyes part. Close your eyes. Right there in your seats as you're viewing this, I want you to come up with a gesture, a gestural shape. So some kind of a hand shape, a form with your hands that is responding to one of these words. I, for example, might say vision, right? My gestural shape might be 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, something like this, right? It's a form. I want everybody to do the same thing, right? So you've got your word, say it to yourself in your head. And here you go. I want to see your shape in 5, 4, 3, 2, and freeze it. All right, so we're seeing our panelists here, right? We've got 5 different gestures that came out of this image. We're going to shake it off. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Just want you to log that away. This is how this kind of work goes from source material into something that becomes an embodied practice on the stage.
Thank you so much, Annie. And I think that the experiential quality to this panel is just a taste of what it's like to actually be in one of these beautiful immersive spaces that ODP is so singularly capable of producing in this city. So now that we have at least some sense of the audience engaging their bodies and not just being passive participants, I invite you all to continue to chat with each other in that chat function. Please do bring any questions or comments or observations or shout outs. It's a much broader and wider and more loving community than even this little screen can capture. And so we'd love to hear from you directly. We also will be taking formal Q&A. So if you want to level a specific question that we take up over the last 20 minutes or so of our time together, please do put that in the Q&A. So the chat is a social space where we can all engage, and the Q&A is where you can make sure that your voice is heard in a more concrete fashion. So part of what is so wonderful about how Ryan set up the experiential dynamics of space and place, as well as how Rachel is talking about how representation both needs to be taken up and then worked through, and then Lena literally doing this in terms of her artistic scapes, it really shows how dynamic art is in the practice of all 3 people, as well as in ODP more broadly. And I think that this is a really good exchange, because this is not just a didactic panel where we're telling the audience members what we think about power, sex, and climate change. Instead, we are here to learn from each other, and we are now, everyone on the screen as well as everybody in the audience, participating in the dynamic process of the production of All the Doubles Are Here. So whether we see you or not, you are already a part of the work of art that will be premiering in May 2021 at Match. So to that end, I think that we want to think about these big themes of power, sex, and climate crisis in terms of how that can continue to contribute to the formation of All the Devils Are Here, a Tempest in the Galapagos. And to that end, I'll open up with a small question to each of the panelists, which of course is containing multitudes, but it's this question of the stories. So we have this overlay of Shakespeare's Tempest, which many might know, which has so many compelling themes. And then we have all these intrigues happening in Floriana. And so because each one of you come from a very different perspective, I was wondering if you can speak to how you read these stories and what are the conditions of possibility for the stories in Floriana, and how does that overlay with the kind of mythic force of Shakespeare allow us to think differently about what could just be a salacious headline, but is instead a very interesting metaphor and allegory for the failures of utopian visions in the face of inequity. So I will start with Rachel and go from there.
Thank you. I guess I will just go ahead and share some slides of images I've been thinking about from this existing archive, and I've accessed them online, which viewers can do, because since the documentary film was made on this topic, there has been like an onslaught, but also the Smithsonian has a lot of these images. And so as we're thinking about storytelling, I think one image, can hold a lot in narratives that are resonating and bouncing back. The way I think about stories is that, and the interesting thing about this topic and the encounters on Floriana is that everyone had a different story about what happened, and how things went down. But I wanted to share the black and white photographic images that actually captured. It would be so easy to have this moment in the 1930s and not have any documentation, but in fact, it was well documented, allowing us to tell the story later in particular ways. So we have some of the kind of pioneers represented in a particular way, but also when I look at this image, I'm reading whiteness. These are German settlers invited by, the Ecuadorian government was inviting people to settle on this island. And then also how, this question of sexuality and what we know about the Baroness and her decision to come to the island, but she brings these two lovers who are also in a relationship with one another. And this image so effectively captures this kind of triangle of a romantic relationship. And we make assumptions about gender and how the people in the image are experiencing and expressing their gender, but they've moved to this other place. And so, and then finally, just to give us some points to point to, how does this Baroness, with all of her power and privilege in terms of wealth and whiteness, perceive herself? What is the story that she's telling herself about the accessibility of this space, her desire to build kind of an empire? It's a colonial act, but she's also determined to break all the rules, and she challenges the boundaries of the other settlers in this space, right? And therein lies the conflict, is that she cannot be contained. So I'm really curious about that way of being the center of your own story and forcing others to respond, and they didn't respond very well. And then taking one story from the past into the present moment, I added to just this last slide of what is a story that we might tell about queerness in the Galapagos Islands in the contemporary moment, right? It's not that there was one moment of the story and it disappeared. It's multiple layers over time and possibly kind of a looping of it. So I'll add that to the conversation.
Wonderful, thank you, Rachel. Ryan or Lena, would one of you like to take it?
I'll jump in. I think just looking at those images too just now, Rachel, is thinking about the Galapagos as this sort of hub of Darwinism too, and the evolution that we see just in those specific shared images is pretty striking, I think. For me, in this piece, or in the historical story, in the Ritter Strauch, the German 20s, 30s, is everybody came there for a slightly different reason, but also the same reason. There's escaping society, and for Ritter and Strauch, it was this nihilist Nietzsche, escaping like other man just in general, and taking yourself and taking the land by storm, and being sort of ownership of everything, as opposed to the Baroness, who's able to create her own entire story. There's so much different information about this woman, not all of it made up, but she's creating as she's going. And whether or not she's a baroness, what country she's from, is she Parisian or Austrian, all of that's sort of up in the air. And the ability to escape the sort of societal norms and move here with her two lovers, who are also, this triangular relationship, in the 20s and 30s, is in and of itself this sort of like, crystallization of privilege and also escapism, and what that does to the idea of finding your own utopia versus usurping somebody else's utopia. The idea of coming into the Ritter and Strauch, we're here by ourselves to be by ourselves, and then inviting the rest of the world to come in and sort of take part in that same aloneness, is one of the most compelling struggles that is created from all of these characters, I think.
That kind of isolation certainly resonates more than ever, each and every day.
Right, absolutely. There's we're all sort of living this shared aloneness, isolation, but then we're also sharing it in new ways, and that, to me, rings with this notion of privilege that you guys have brought up. There's a privilege of escape that we see, definitely coming through in this story. We're basically based on this privileged notion of escape, or we were talking earlier about a pastoral ideal, right? So our colonialist nation is based on this pastoral ideal and idealization of something grander and something where anything is possible, as if nothing was previously. And so same thing of kind of encroaching in on someone else's space is happening. And I think it allows us to kind of look at our own complicit nature in these kinds of idealizations of pastoralism and also encroachment on other people's spaces. I also think it's important to be weary again of that pastoral ideal. And these were some jokes kind of going around, but during COVID, our sort of isolated times, there's this kind of return to gardening, bread making, et cetera. And so an idealization of that. And I think that's great, don't get me wrong, but to rethink our notions of progress, which needs to happen here. Yes, we definitely need to rethink big agriculture, absolutely. But also step back and maybe be careful not to idealize this notion of gardening or of being somewhere pristine, this uninhabited land. So our notions of nature, I think, need to be really complexified and take into account the privilege. Same thing with, I joke at the Windows wallpaper, or so we have these technologies of culture of obsolescence. We're filling landfill. So we have the landscape is interesting to me here with the backdrop, right? So it's beautiful, it's untouched. Our gardens are these sort of little sources of poetry that we post on Instagram, but then we're ignoring the landfills. So I like that you guys have included that almost as like raining on the viewer in a way that you can't completely ignore. And if anything, nature and culture or industry are really intertwined in the landscapes that you guys have designed. And I think that needs to happen in our minds as well. Or Apple naming all their operating systems after, national parks, et cetera. So we really inhabit all these contradictions. So how are we complicit and how can we complicate these landscapes? And I think these archives, if we dig a little deeper, are more complicated than they seem at first glance.
Yeah, I really would love to build on that and just thinking about what is beyond the parameters of the frame that we don't get to know, that we're just always imagining. So with those photographs, there's also a silent film that was made, so folks are interested in being at the center, but there's so much not in the frame. And one of the things left out that they kind of mention in some of the record is that there was an Ecuadorian servant that went with them, right? So Manuel Valdivioso is his name, but that's not part of the story that the people are actually telling themselves in the historic moment, right? There was also a mule that became a contested workhorse, like they needed it to survive, but it gets left out often.
I'm going to jump in because we're not leaving him out because Manuel is in there. So Yoshi Pineda, one of our company members, is dual cast as Caliban, who is the oppressed, really mistreated, abused, accused of rape slave who is indigenous to the island in the Tempest. And so we're making connections between that character and Manuel, who is very much not in the frame, right? Not in any of these. And I think part of, what's so interesting, and just to connect with both, Lena and Rachel, but these ideas, yes, what's in the frame, how do we, and who is telling the story, right? That part of what drew the Ritters, and even that's sort of an interesting, they call themselves the Ritters, but they were unmarried, Doris Strauch and Friedrich Ritter. But part of what Friedrich Ritter talks specifically about drawing him to that island was that it really wasn't generative and productive and habitable. His thinking was it would be able to support the two of us and no one else. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that can only support us. And he has this christening moment where he christens the island before anyone else is there. And part of his christening is essentially no strangers come. Let me cast this spell so nobody else comes here because I don't want to be around people. It's a very deliberate step out of community. And I think, there is this, there's a real sense of battling for ownership of the story. From these historical characters, we have Ritter sending letters sending his version of the story to the Atlantic Monthly. We have Doris Strauch, who wrote Satan Came to Eden, her version of events. Margaret Whitmer's Floriana tells her version of the events, and they all conflict. And some really interesting ways. Ritter's story, his verbal description of the island is in direct conflict with the maps that he draws. So there are, just lots of really interesting conflicts in what this island was, and why these people went, and then what happened when they got there. There's a real battle for the role of narrator that then we're trying to really play with and unpack through laying the Tempest on top of it. It's sort of giving us, the Tempest is actually our vehicle, Lena, to kind of say, okay, how can we look at this nature, in collision of nature and industry? How can we look at progress and utopia? So I'm going to be quiet because I'm done. My turn's over.
I think what you just said really connects to what Rachel was saying as well with the archive and who owns the story. It's this question of authenticity. And I think it's really interesting that you decided to put Shakespeare's The Tempest on there, because what you're doing is pulling away from an ethnographic dance project. Your goal is not to be documentary or didactic necessarily, but instead to tell a story that makes us feel something. And I wonder if that was Ritter's goal in some ways, because there's contradictions and conflicting. Was he just trying to create a sentiment of himself, the Baroness as well, rather than saying, this is really me?
And I'm also just so interested in the story that people brought to the island. So they already had like such a deep narrative about what it would be and how, and then to have the Baroness, it sounds like, was the one that disrupts all of that, because especially because of her gender, right? I mean, as a woman, to feel that she owns all of that power in that space. And what I read briefly, there's this moment where she arrives to introduce herself and expects that her hand would be kissed. And I'm really thinking about like, what are the translation of embodying that kind of level of privilege and power? So when it's Dr. Ritter, I think, that rejects that gesture, he won't move into response in the correct way, his body. And so there's all this narrative on the body already coming into these early interactions.
Beautiful. It also really ties back to the ways within which the kind of progress narratives in the 19th century that are a part of scientific development and the advance of knowledge, as well as the development of technologies and forms of industrialism, how the conceit of this is a good and as productive certainly has had effects in terms of raising quality of life globally. Yet, of course, the people who get to benefit from the privileges are the people who get to think that they will go to this island, be kissed in the appropriate way, and be able to both escape and be dominant at the same time. And so I think that the really interesting tension between the will to dominate in these progress narratives and then the will to subvert the very social norms and cultural norms that we see in these figures really shows just how complex it is. There's no clear evil and there's no clear good. Instead, we just have the use of tools in ways that destruct and construct. And so I'd like to take us to the question of the way that the climate crisis is enfolded within All the Devils Are Here. But then also, you had responded to Ryan, Lena, talking about how wonderful it was that you actually have the kind of ecological consciousness in the set design. And so there's that moment for reflection. And I'm wondering if each of the panelists would like to address how the climate crisis shows up in this work, as well as in what the possibilities look like in the stories.
From the overall environment, as you could see in, I'm just going to screen share again for a second, I guess. In a lot of the surrounding source is all pulled from these recycled elements. And the reasoning behind that is twofold. I mean, it creates this abstracted version of flora around us, but specifically is using it out of used up materials, not even just like, oh, here we're using this again, but it's like these materials are in our normal views, like dead, trash, left, expired, and empty, and trying to pinpoint that same sense of entering this new land, coming here for your certain reasons, and then having a lot of that either pulled away or you pulling it yourself away, I think is important to tie into the climate change. I think that as we are here in this story, one of the parts of the story that we haven't explained yet is, aside from the three groups living together, is that then we have Baroness's lovers running off. We have a mysterious death, two mysterious deaths, people gone missing, and this sort of like fire and culmination that sort of happens at this sort of crucible moment. And I think that tying that idea of coming to the island, and it's not industrialization, but it is like and colonialism, and it's taking over a specific space, a specific nature, and transforming it into your own, and the idea of ownership over that, and fighting amongst each other, but also fighting against what you were trying to own in the first place. And in the idea of climate change on top of that is that throughout this piece, it's constant raising of tensions and people who are thrown together and fighting either, blatantly or passively, and feeling that temperature rise and feeling that sense of island closing in, waters closing in on you, I think is important into that idea of isolation, sorry, and also the man's impact or somebody's own impact on to that situation.
Yeah, I want to just tag team there. I think that, that idea of these people, it's very deliberate. The Wittmer clan and the Ritter clan are very deliberately trying to escape the rising tension, the rising global tensions, right? They know it's right before the Nazis take control. Wittmer was a government bureaucrat. He saw very clearly what was happening. And they, once they are there on the island, there's a British naval ship that comes, and this ends up being part of our performance as well, but that comes and then realizes they are German citizens who are here on this island, but they've come before the advent of war and before the rise of the Nazis. So there's a real, who are you as a German national, but who stepped away? Just lots of interesting questions there. And I think that there really is there's a climate connection there, right? This rise of industrialism, this rise of the mechanism of war, these folks are only able to go to this island because of a rise in media, communications, transportation, all of that. We only have the images that we have from Captain Alan Hancock. He was an oil baron and railroad tycoon based in Los Angeles. All of the images you're seeing that we're using are in the Smithsonian Institute from one of his expeditions, which was let's go with scientists. He was funding scientists on his great big pleasure yacht. He took scientists and he went to the Galapagos, and they would bring back specimens to go to the zoos. But it was a pleasure cruise that was directly connected to industry and advancement of science, and all these things were overlapping. So it is these folks trying to escape all of this storm rising around them that is political and social and environmental. That really is the birth of the intensity, of the climate crisis. I mean, it's the source of the climate crisis that we're dealing with now, and I think that's why it's so rich to me. It's why this again, the Tempest provides us this vehicle to have an actual storm, the whole time. And exactly as Ryan's saying, we really are trying to give the audience a sense of drowning, both in the social, political, emotional storm that is happening on the island itself, and these, writ small, with these people who can't figure out how to live together. And then this world around them that can't figure out how to live together, and that is destroying itself in the attempt to gain dominance. And that, it's not any different from what's happening right now. We just are doing it to ourselves. The oil is now plastics, right? So we're trying to drown ourselves and audience in the crisis, but so we have to look at it.
Yeah, in water and in trash.
Yeah.
It made me.
There's no escape. Go, sorry.
No, you go ahead, Lena.
2 lines. There's no escape. There's no escaping COVID. There is no escaping the climate crisis. And so we need to accept the fact that the train is piercing through the landscape and not, try to stuff our ears with a bunch of leaves.
Yeah, and there's no escape from plastic, I think. And, having lived in the Dominican Republic, I mean, it's just plastic water bottles, really, but you have all this tourism because people are dreaming of an escape. But where does all the waste from the tourism end up? And it usually is in the oceans. And folks on the island can't leave, right? So, but when hearing Ryan talk about this incredible set design, I was really interested in those moments when, Ryan, you are using plastics to project onto, and you were talking about that. And I was thinking, I think I tried to describe it to you all before when we talked about this like Texas-sized, but it's the Great Pacific Plastic Island. It's like Great Pacific Plastic, what is it? Sorry. I was looking it up, but there's a patch, that's the word. It's a patch because all of the plastic comes together, and it is the size of the state of Texas where we are, but we don't see it, right? It's beyond our imagination and the frame.
Rachel, I just, on the chat, they're saying gyre.
Oh, I haven't heard that word, Brian, but I'm gonna use it.
On the point of imagination, that seems to be so much of what the immersive aspect of the artistic productions and OTP are about. It's trying to take something that is so big, right, in terms of the imaginary, the climate crisis and global heating, and give us a sense of what it is and disrupt our habitual patterns of thought, action, and feeling day to day. Not so that we can see the totality, but that so we can actually see what it is in order to recognize our complicity and our responsibility to take it up each and every day. And I think this hits on one of the comments that I see recurring in the chat function, which is the critique of the cottagecore aesthetic and the desire to flee and have your restful experience, which of course just produces more waste. And so when it comes to thinking about the privileges of isolation, who gets to be isolated, right? Who gets to be living in a home where we can work day to day in these conditions, even if undesirable? And when thinking about not only ODP and the immersive aspect here, but the very real ways within which neoliberalism essentially constructs the idea of self-care as a form of self-protection and isolation that then obviates critique of the very forms of power and domination that are creating and continuing the forms of the climate crisis. I think it really brings these things together, where on the one hand, we want to say cottage aesthetic, we want to bake bread, we want to home farm, we want to have these daily practices that are very similar to what my ancient monks are doing in the desert, as well as in Gaul. And so we're creating these intentional lives. Yet the question is, how do we shape ourselves in these daily practices in a way that does not blind us to these huge catastrophes, but instead awakens us to the sensibilities that we might all take up as a call to action for ourselves, as people, as professors, as artists, as policymakers, and as citizens of Houston. And I think that all of you as academics, as well as artists, bring that kind of sensibility to your work, that disruptive potential and the kind of queering of our everyday habits of thought and action in ways that get amplified in COVID, but have been here before. The conditions were set and they're not going anywhere. So my kind of gesture to the future is, what can we do from here? What do we do once we have our perceptions shaken up? What do we do when we experience one of these immersive pieces by Annie, where we get thrown into, Weimar Republic and Dada Gert, or the Panopticon in futurist dystopia, or Floriana with murder and arrests and stress? What do we do from here in terms of navigating the affective economies? And, what can we do as a community? So that's a larger question that hits upon some of the points in the chat. I invite audience members to contribute to the Q&A, and we'll start moderating those questions directly, or I'll check in the chat as well. But if anybody wants to talk about the way within which we can actually cope with the realities of this moment in and through art and critique, even as we're embracing the realities of farming and connection in ways that are atypical to the 21st century.
I think in my work, I try to do this in two ways. So one, and I think this is really similar to Open Dance Project's sort of approach, is creating a sense of agency in the viewer. So the viewer is a participant, is a co-maker in a sense of the experience. The experience is also never the same twice. And so that leads me to my second point, which is kind of trying to cultivate a being in the present. So as much as we need to be forward thinking and critical of our path, sort of thinking about temporality in this. So if something's never going to happen again, then we try to appreciate it, right? Or sort of dwell in that moment. So how can we cultivate a kind of active listening or a paying attention to things? And I think this happens with our bodies as well. So with ODP's project, this again brings us back to maybe a sense of agency or a centeredness of finding ourselves as tiny individuals. And so it's this very humbling experience, but also very much of a felt one. And I think that it's a start. It's obviously not a solution to these giant crises, but those are ways that I try to at least approach my work that I think really has a lot of affinities with the kinds of things that we're talking about. Annie, Ryan, and
I think that's what's so exciting about what I've seen of your work is that it is, there is a visual art aspect to it standalone, but it comes alive when there are other people involved. And in the same sense, Open Dance Project in these immersive pieces is, they don't exist without an audience interaction. The audience is in conversation with the dancers and with all of the artists. I mean, we were saying that, I think Niki hit on that when we were doing some of the introductions, is about this conversation here today is really also part of the finished product when we get there. And I think that breaking down the typical viewer structure by doing these immersive pieces allows for an audience to become that same active participant that they are in your work, Lena, and gives an audience member a different sense of agency. And that does not say, hey, audience member, everybody go out and solve climate change, but it does allow you to be part of an active conversation that you are having with other people, just like we are today.
I would add, it's a really valuable and exciting space because we're less and less we are like experienced at these kinds of interactions. So the isolation makes us feel rusty with the connection. And I've been just thinking about how to mobilize young people who are used to saying, well, I'm talking with, but they mean I'm texting back and forth with someone. And it's a really different experience. And so thinking about, Lena, also what you're saying around co-making with my students in a feminist classroom, I'm like half of the work is helping them to understand that we're making the space together so that we can all be here as all parts of ourselves. So I think of the arts in that way and keeping alive some part of myself under capitalism that allows me to, be all these parts of myself and explore and experience.
I think that idea of co-making is key, that Rachel's talking about. I think that, I do hope that our performances are an opportunity for people to come in and because of some of the otherworldliness of it, some of the mythic nature of it, have a critical distance that allows them to maybe see things in a way that they recognize ultimately that we're all implicated in, right? But that you're not initially, we're not trying to accuse in our work. We're trying to say, hey, you guys, look at these problems that we're all in together. But then I think okay, then what do we do with that recognition? For me, the answer is in our educational practices. I think every single one of us here are teachers. Every single one of our panelists, whether they realize it or not, are teachers, right? So for me, it really is about, it's why our classroom work, which now is almost all, but not entirely virtual, is really about collaborative composition. It is saying, okay, we're going to start with these same images, right? That we're creating our show about. What happens when you present this to a bunch of 7th graders and we talk about it and we make something out of it. And I think it's the making something out of it moment, right? That is a progression of that social emotional learning trajectory that is saying, okay, how do I make this connection? I'm understanding where I fit in this. I'm understanding where my, co-maker, fellow student, and I sit in this as a pair. Now, how do I imagine and create in response to some of this critical thinking in a way that Niki keeps reminding us, then can become constructive and productive thinking, right? It doesn't have to just stop at the critical spot. It can go into building something better. I do believe it, right? I think if we didn't believe it, we wouldn't be doing this.
Beautiful.
I have something to add, and maybe this is a weird elephant in the room, and that we're often afraid of talking about sometimes with art, or afraid of somehow devaluing the aesthetic moment. But when I make something, I just make it because I want to sometimes. But what is the connection maybe between content and intent? And then also, where is art and activism or politics in all this? So the elephant, I'd say, is politics. So I talk to my students and I often say, we don't exist in a vacuum. Sometimes I make something because it's beautiful and I want to make it and it makes me feel good. But then the work lives its life. It does its thing in the world. And so everything, in a sense, is political because it is part of that sort of cultural, historical moment. Back to saying I don't exist in a vacuum. And so if we can then agree that everything is political to some extent, then I think we can start breathing and saying, okay, now what? But of course, there's this reticence often in art to say my work does this thing.
Well, and I'll just, very quickly, I think some of that is on the very practical level, right? Like we're battling inequity by talking about these issues in contemporary bodies. We're battling it in our casting. We're battling it in our hiring practices. We're battling it in our pedagogical practices. We're battling it by saying artists deserve a living wage. And so we're going to pay that to our company members, even though that means we can only be together 25 hours a week, not 40, right? So I think there's some on the very practical. I think there's some on the practical how-dos. How do we manufacture our craft, or, how do we craft our work? And how do we make sure we're making decisions in those practices that are parallel, that are us practicing what we're preaching, or, engaging those questions that we're asking on the stage in aesthetic ways. How are we dealing with them, in a very practical way in our economy? And in our, politic.
What's the work that's going on outside of the picture frame that we were talking about before?
Yeah, I think sometimes it can be really hard to let go of control of how it is then interpreted. And, and we see that in this historical narrative too. It's like, oh, one thing is happening on this island and thousands of miles away, it's being retold and reinterpreted. And, that can cause us anxiety if we're not able to let go of that control over the thing, the story, the narrative we have. And we cannot control the narratives that other people have. And we barely know, unless we talk to one another, what they're seeing when we're all looking at the same thing.
Beautiful. So the dominance that the Baroness, that Ritter are trying to engage, even as they isolate, it's interesting on so many levels. I think that in the picture that's been painted across the different panelists, as well as Annie, I think the question Ryan asked at the very beginning, why this piece? Why now? And how that informs your set design. We said we're all in the same boat, because the reality is that we are in these macrocosms that we cannot understand. However, we can start to see what is around the frame, and we can, as Annie was talking about, actually engage in those practices that show not just window dressing of labels or here's what we care about, but engages in the practices of labor, practices of production, and practices of viewing on the part of us audience members as well, that has that kind of attunement to the aesthetic as political, to the content reflecting the intent. And I think it's beautiful. Also deeply ominous, the way that Lena said, we are on the cusp of what's about to go down. However, with what can go down, we also have, as Rachel was saying, the possibility of taking up the representations, taking up the knowledge of the structural conditions that enabled those narratives to be dominant, and then undercutting them, reshaping representations, and creating new ways of thinking, seeing, and feeling. So with that in mind, I want to make sure that the audience is again invited to engage in direct questions. There are a couple questions in the chat that we'll go to, but please do engage the Q&A. There are some really wonderful audience members out there. We see you, so feel free to participate because we're all hungry for that as well. I do want to get to one question in the chat, which is a question from YouTube, I believe. Militia Bentley had asked, why are the terms Satan and devil utilized in the writings and ideas of these stories?
I can take that one. I threw out in the chat one of the quotes that comes into our title is "Hell is empty and all the devils are here." That is something that's said as the ship is going down in the Tempest. So that's where that, our title comes from, but it is used over and over again in the narrative of the Galapagos affair, which is, what we call this crazy time on Floriana. And it comes from Ritter himself set up in his writings in the Atlantic Monthly. He called, he was saying an Adam and Eve in the Galapagos. So he set up, he and Dora as a contemporary Adam and Eve, and Floriana as an Eden. So he started it. I guess I can say he started it. The Tempest connection just is one of those, amazing synchronicities that just absolutely layers on perfectly well and explains, in the Tempest, they're talking about the devils that are on the island are Prospero, who was Duke of Milan, who had been unseated nefariously. And so the Tempest, for those who don't know, it just ended up being it's a story of oppression and revenge of different sorts, and magic. And there's a lot of that going on in the Galapagos affair as well. So Doris Straub called her book "Satan Came to Eden." And a lot of it is that these people were looking for an Eden and it went horribly awry through death. It was Ritter died of food poisoning or maybe intentional poisoning. The Baroness and Philipson were missing, potentially killed by Lawrence. Then Lawrence runs away and missing, and his body is later found mummified on a nearby island. So it really went bad. And that's essentially, where it's coming from us, and in these retellings are that these people went searching for an Eden. And yes, there was a serious fall from grace, as one of the people in the chat was saying.
Somebody in the chat before, Deborah Joseph, had said, it makes me think of vacation housing developments, built environments in once filled with nature, but now are just inviting people to live on top of each other, which is the exact reaction I had to this initial story when I first was introduced to the documentary that told it to me, is just that sense of, I'm saying it's not exploration necessarily, but the sense of finding something that is just yours. And then the minute somebody else comes, your ownership of that is divided in half. And then somebody else comes and somebody else comes. And there's this sense that you don't have what you used to, somebody stealing something from you. And just saying that out loud right now reminds me of all of the conversations about civil rights and taking away rights from other people by allowing another community to have rights, and that's I bet Rachel can touch on this better for me in terms of actual words. So off
You're
to you,
onto
Rachel.
something, Ryan. You are totally onto something around like privilege. Like when I look at this story, I just keep saying like, what is it about whiteness that would make people feel that, you know, they need to conquer this new space and it be theirs, that you know, that could be culturally produced and that they carry this idea of their own identity to that space. And then there's this, you know, upset that someone else would come and encroach on that because why can't I be the pioneer? Right. And I mean, I'm very curious with this, with the space of the Galapagos, you know, and continuing tourism, right? That people are paying to have that experience of going to this untouched space. That mostly you can't walk on it, but they, you know, and the origin of the species.
Beautiful. So I think that we've learned as an audience as well as panel that the more we talk about it, the more fascinating All the Devils Are Here becomes. So I encourage everybody to join us at Match on May 6th through the 15th of this year, where hopefully we'll be able to have some kind of socially distant, yet still immersive experience of what's to come. I want to honor all the people who are submitting wonderful affirmations in the chat. And I think Michael Hardiman has made a number of points about how we need to recognize difference and mistakes in order to then figure out how to move from here. And I think that the diversity of perspectives on this panel, as well as the diverse ways within which we think about power, sex, and climate change within All the Devils Are Here, really presents a really compelling way and a very necessary way for us to think in the city of oil about what our future looks like. So I thank everybody, and I will bring our panel to an official stop so we can have Zandra close us off.